A good sky can make or break a landscape painting. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 essential tips that are really going to improve your sky painting capabilities. So my first essential tip is to work on wet paper. Now, if I take this scrap here and I paint on it dry, you'll see that we get fairly hard edges. Now, if you look at a sky that's gone wrong, a watercolor sky that's just full of mess and mistakes, what do we always see? We always see hard edges and drying lines. Now, if I wet this paper first and take some water across like this, then the paint that I put on next has soft edges instead of hard edges. So I'm going to show you this principle on a larger piece of paper, bearing in mind that I haven't stretched this paper because it's just for a tutorial. So if you stretch your paper, you'll get an even better result. So we need to wet the surface first. Now, are there circumstances when you might not wet the paper first on a sky? Of course there are. However, I would nearly always wet first, even if I'm working in a single area. So it's possible, for example, if you're experienced, to go onto a sky where you might have, say, a cloud that's dry, a white cloud, and then you could add some cloud shadow. You could just wet that cloud. However, if you're a beginner, that's very difficult and dangerous. And the reason is that even water alone can leave a drying line when applied on top of dry paint. So let's look at the kind of sky that we can get now by working on wet paper. And you see that as soon as we start to apply this paint, and this is cerulean, so it's going to be a very granular effect this time. The colour's not really the point here. It doesn't matter which colours you're using, but by working on wet paper like this, we get these lovely soft edges. Now notice that I say wet, not damp. This paper, just in the minute or two that I've been talking, has started to dry and it's now damp. If I continue to work on it now, what I'm doing is introducing wet onto damp. That will cause backruns and drying lines and mistakes. You have to do this process of working on wet paper really, really quickly and then leave it alone. Far too many beginners keep working and working and working. So at this point you're saying to me, but what if there's loads of stuff going on in the sky? I've got all different colours and all different things. That's what we're going to talk about in our second essential tip. If you are enjoying this video, can I ask you to do me a quick favour? Can you please click that like button, that thumbs up button? If you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment here on YouTube, all of these things are free. It will help my channel to grow and I can teach more people like you how to paint and draw. So my second essential tip is to work in layers, and I would say that all professional watercolorists know this, but a lot of amateur watercolorists don't know it, especially these days where we're not taking so many real life classes because of COVID. We're learning from people on the internet. The downside to that is there's a lot of cuts in videos. So an artist like myself might demonstrate something and then we might say, right, let that dry and then we'll do the next bit. Well, of course, it's just a second later because no one's going to film themselves sitting staring at a piece of paper for an hour on YouTube. That is not going to help my average view duration. You have to keep things moving on YouTube because people have short attention spans. But what this means is that it can be rather deceptive and beginners can get an idea that something perhaps was left to dry for 5 minutes when in fact it might have been left to dry for 2 or 3 hours. Now this one here has not been left to dry for too long, but it's dry enough for me to demonstrate on. So what I've got now is I've got some clean water, and in order to work on this, rather than when it was damp I just kept working on it, which led to uneven drying because we had wet on damp and everything went wrong, what I did is I just worked quickly, left it alone, let it dry, and now we're going to put another layer over the top. Now how many times can you do this? I've done it up to 10 or 11 times before now. That's not to say that that's always possible because it does depend a lot on the quality of the paper that you're using. If you're using a cheaper paper, you can end up removing the sizing. That's the coating they put on it. What can happen then is that you can get bleeding even on dry paper. It's a sure sign that you've removed the sizing from it. Another thing that can happen with very cheap paper is that it can bead and come up. Now this paper I'm working on here, just because it's for demonstration purposes, this is very cheap paper. But even paper like this, I can go back in probably 3-4 times before the paper starts to degrade, and on a good quality cotton paper you may be able to go back in as many as 8, 10 or even more times. So what we did was we worked quickly, in less than a minute we got our paint on and we left it alone. It's not like oil painting. You can't spend hours working on one particular cloud and getting it the exact right shape. Watercolor just doesn't work well under those circumstances. So I've got clean water. Now I'm going to go back in and put another layer on my sky. Another advantage to this is that if you have any sort of slight drying lines, you may find that just putting the water on like this actually smooths out those areas. Now when you apply the water the second time, what you want to do is really start from the areas that are lightest. Don't start from an area that's really dark because you may spread some of that pigment down. If you're careful and if you're using staining pigments, you may find you get very little movement whatsoever, but I'm applying it quite gently because you can see it does slightly agitate the layer below. As I said, that can be a good thing if it needs smoothing out a little bit. I'm now free to go back in and perhaps add a second colour. So I've got a different blue here. I've got an indigo, so I'm going a bit darker here. I could even, if I wanted to, add some pink. And typically I'll use these layers to go in and add things like cloud shadow. If you're doing a sunset, I would always advise actually that you start with the warmer colours, with the oranges and the yellows. I'm going to talk more about colour mixing for skies in a moment. But you can see that I can start to build up a more complex sky. Again, just after a minute or so, once this starts to dry, and the amount of time that you can work on this, don't come into the comments and say, well, how long can I work on this? Because it depends on the temperature and the humidity where you are. If you are in a really, really hot country, I was in Egypt a few weeks ago, I would be looking at this process being 20 or 30 seconds. In England, in the winter, maybe I could go for as long as 2 minutes before it started to get to the point where it was beginning to dry. And it only needs to be beginning to dry because if I go onto this damp paint now with a wet paintbrush, I'm introducing wet onto damp. The wet is going to spread. It's going to make all sorts of nasty drying lines and shapes. So the idea that I want to leave you with here is that you can work quickly in layers, allow it to dry completely between layers, and in this way you can build up a complex sky without all of those terrible drying lines. So our third tip is a colour mixing tip. Now I've always said to people there's only one colour you can't get away with in the sky, and that's green. Now somebody in my art group on Facebook actually proved me wrong the other day because they were painting the northern lights. Of course you do get green in the sky with the northern lights, but to see green in a sky is so rare, and it almost never happens. So you can get away with pinks and purples and yellows and oranges and blues appearing in your sky. But as soon as you go into green, it's going to look rather strange. Now the way that people end up accidentally getting green in their sky, of course, is to overlap the yellow and the blue. However, it's not quite as simple as that because there are other colours that will lead to green as well. And those are any colours that contain yellow that mix with any colours that contain blue. So let's look first of all about how to avoid this happening. So the simple answer is that you start by trying to keep these colours apart. And I'll go through some more of the colours that can cause green in a moment, but let's look at the application first of all. So imagine I've got a sunset or something like that. It's always a good idea to apply your yellow or orange first. So I might add some of these warmer colours down at the base. Perhaps there's some yellow as well. And then typically what I would do is I would let these areas dry before going in with the blue and be very careful not to overlap. So I'm not letting it dry on this occasion, but I would let it dry normally. Just doing it for speed here on YouTube. So it looks a bit stripy at the moment, doesn't it? It looks a bit like a flag. But we can go in between as well. We can put some in here like this. And being very careful that we don't overlap too much so that we're not getting that green appear. Now before I talk about which colours will make green, there is a solution if you start to get green. So let's start to overlap these. And oh dear, we're starting to get some green appearing here in the middle. What can we do? What we need to do is use the opposite colour to green. Now we don't want to use red because that would lead to brown. So what we're going to do is we're going to use pink. Now you always need to have a pink in your palette. I'll grab a bit of this one here. I think it's some quinacridone magenta. So it sort of goes into the purple end of the spectrum. We're going to put a little bit of that pink in here. And what will happen is you'll just push those colours back towards the neutral part of the spectrum. The worst that can happen is it'll go a kind of a greyish colour, but you will have at least neutralised that green. So let's talk about colours that can lead to green in skies. So of course we've got our yellows like this. We've got our warmer yellows like this one. But actually we've also got orange. Orange is a secondary colour and it's made from red and yellow. So this colour here has an awful lot of yellow in. If you've ever mixed orange, you'll find you need very little red and quite a lot of yellow. So this has a high proportion of yellow in, which means it's likely to go green if it hits anything blue or that has blue in it. So again, the colours that can make green, we're going in, of course, we've got our blues. We've got all sorts of blues. We've got a cerulean like this one, or a stronger blue like this cobalt. But again, we have any colours that have blue in them. Now, I wouldn't include purple in this because purple is actually mostly blue pigment and the pink is the opposite colour to green. So you're not going to have such a trouble. If your purple overlaps your yellow, you'll just really get a grey colour. If it does go slightly green, you can put a bit more pink in. But another colour I want to talk to you about is grey, and that would be something like a Payne's grey. So here we have Payne's grey, or if you've mixed a grey pigment yourself, grey is majority blue pigment. Therefore, you could get the strange happening that you would overlap your grey and your orange and end up with something slightly greenish. So let's actually try it on the paper and see if it happens. So let's put some orange in here. Firstly, we'll try with the blue, and we start to get this very muddy green. What about the Payne's grey? This may or may not work because it really depends on the brand that you have and the amount of blue pigment in that brand. But here we are. Look at that. We're definitely getting greenish grey tones there. So whilst you're painting, the rule is don't overlap anything with yellow in. That goes right up to these warm oranges with anything with blue in, and that includes all the greys, especially Payne's grey, which is a very blue grey. And if you do accidentally get green, then the answer is to put some pink over the top, something like a permanent rose, or even better, a quinacridone rose. The more blue the pink, the more sort of Barbie the pink is, and the less scarlet it is, the better it will be at neutralising the green in your sky. You can rescue that sky and get it looking back to normal, of course, unless you're painting the Northern Lights. Thank you so much for watching this 3 essential tips video. Before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. I've got lots of free stuff down there for you. I've got free downloadable PDFs with art tips on. I've even got a free watercolour painting mini course that you can take. Don't forget to subscribe to see more videos like this one, and you can watch another one of my videos right now.